Have you ever stopped to think about what it truly means to have your identity taken away? Imagine being born into a world where your name is not your own, where the language you should speak is forbidden, and the culture that defines your people is erased. For millions of Africans brought to the Americas, this was not imagination, it was reality. These individuals were stripped of their names, their languages, their religions, their cultural expressions, and even the knowledge of their own histories. Every thread that connected them to who they were and who they could have been was systematically severed. This was not just a momentary loss, it was a deliberate, centuries-long process designed to dismantle a people's sense of self and to impose upon them a narrative of inferiority. Families were torn apart, traditions obliterated, and the wisdom of generations lost to the ocean of the Middle Passage. Children grew up without the guidance of elders who had been taken away. Skills, stories, and sacred practices that could have sustained entire communities were instead replaced by a forced dependence on the culture and systems of their captors. Think about it. For 300 years, Black people were denied the basic human rights to learn, to read, to worship freely, and to even know their own past. By the time many were allowed into churches, a place that should have offered solace and hope, the imagery and narratives they encountered were already dominated by white faces and ideals. Even spiritual symbols, like Jesus and angels, were depicted in ways that alienated them from their own humanity. Over generations, this constant imposition of external authority and validation created what some scholars now describe as a programmed mindset, one that taught obedience, submission, and the acceptance of limitations that were never naturally theirs. But this story is not meant to leave you in despair. It is meant to awaken understanding, to reveal the roots of historical injustice, and to highlight the extraordinary resilience of those who survived against all odds. It is about recognizing that this disconnection from identity is not a mark of weakness, but a consequence of calculated oppression. And it is a call to action, a reminder that reclaiming history, culture, and self-worth is not only possible but necessary. As we journey through this story today, we will uncover the forces that tried to define an entire race as inferior. We will explore the ideologies, laws, and pseudo-scientific beliefs that perpetuated these false narratives. But most importantly, we will shine a light on the power of knowledge, the strength of cultural reclamation, and the enduring spirit of a people determined to define themselves on their own terms. If you are ready to explore this untold history and understand how identity, culture, and resilience intertwine, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you do not miss any of the eye-opening stories we share. This is more than history, it is a journey into understanding the past to empower the future. The story of how a mindset of obedience and perceived inferiority took root among Black people is a tale that spans centuries, stretching from the early days of forced enslavement through generations of social, economic, and political oppression, each layer reinforcing the last, leaving an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of a people. When Africans were first brought across the Atlantic, they were not merely uprooted from their lands. They were severed from the very threads of their identity that gave their lives meaning and agency. Names, languages, spiritual practices, familial bonds, and cultural traditions were violently stripped away, leaving people to navigate a foreign world where their humanity was systematically denied. This initial severing was not an accident, but a carefully orchestrated mechanism designed to transform vibrant, self-aware communities into populations conditioned to obey, to survive under the dictates of others, and to internalize a sense of limitation imposed upon them rather than born from their own abilities. In the first generations, Survival itself became a constant negotiation between resistance and compliance. Yet over time, patterns of obedience became habitual, woven into the fabric of daily life. The plantation system, with its hierarchy, punishments, and rewards, created an environment in which submission was learned as the safest path, and self-assertion often came at a cost too great to bear. This habitual obedience, once rooted, was further reinforced by the structures that emerged after emancipation. The abolition of slavery did not come with the restoration of autonomy or access to the tools necessary for self-determination. Instead, freed individuals encountered a society in which social, economic, and political power remained firmly in the hands of those who had once enslaved them. Laws were created to restrict opportunities, access to education was limited, and the economy was structured in such a way that freed people often remained dependent on the very systems that had oppressed them. Welfare dependence, in its earliest forms, can be traced back to this post-emancipation reality, where newly freed communities were left to rely on structures that were never designed to empower them but to contain them, creating a subtle yet enduring feedback loop between survival, obedience, and perceived limitation. The entrenchment of perceived inferiority was not confined to economic and social systems alone. Intellectual, scientific, and cultural narratives were systematically manipulated to support the belief that black people were inherently less capable, less intelligent, or less worthy than their white counterparts. Pseudo-scientific theories, whether in anthropology, medicine, or education, were used to rationalize social hierarchies, teaching both oppressors and the oppressed that these divisions were natural, inevitable, and unchangeable. Over time, such beliefs seeped into everyday consciousness, shaping interactions, expectations, and self-perception. When a child grows up hearing, seeing, or experiencing the repeated assertion that their contributions are less valued, that their talents are diminished in comparison, and that their potential is inherently limited, it becomes easy for that narrative to internalize, even subconsciously, forming a lens through which they perceive themselves and the world. Yet, this was not a story of inevitability. Throughout history, countless individuals and communities resisted these narratives, carving out spaces for learning, cultural preservation, and leadership despite systemic barriers. Schools founded by formerly enslaved people, churches that doubled as centers of political organization, and cultural expressions maintained in music, storytelling, and art became vessels through which a sense of self and communal pride could survive. These acts of resistance, often subtle yet profound, were crucial in countering the pervasive message of inferiority, even as the broader society continued to reinforce it through laws, media, and social customs. The tension between oppression and agency, between the imposition of a limiting mindset and the enduring assertion of humanity, has defined much of the Black experience in the Americas, highlighting both the destructive power of systemic control and the resilience required to confront it. As the generations progressed, the impact of centuries-long conditioning manifested in complex ways. Patterns of dependence and compliance were sometimes mistaken for inherent incapacity, when in reality, they were learned strategies, adaptations to a hostile world designed to minimize harm and maximize survival. Families, communities, and institutions struggled to navigate a society that simultaneously promised freedom while constraining opportunity, leading to cycles in which survival, economic necessity, and social expectation reinforced each other, often to the detriment of self-determination. Yet, Within these cycles, seeds of empowerment persisted as individuals sought education, pursued economic advancement, and cultivated spaces where cultural knowledge and pride could flourish, demonstrating that the legacy of oppression could be challenged and reshaped through conscious effort and communal support. In examining this history, it becomes clear that the mindset of obedience and perceived inferiority was not a natural condition but the product of intentional, long-standing social engineering. It was the result of a deliberate layering of practices designed to strip a people of agency, to suppress knowledge, and to create dependence, reinforced by the very structures meant to govern and control daily life. Recognizing this allows for a deeper understanding of both the challenges faced by Black communities and the extraordinary resilience demonstrated in the face of such systemic adversity. The story is not simply one of limitation imposed from without, but of the ongoing struggle to reclaim identity, assert agency, and build self-determination within a society that historically sought to deny these very rights. It is a narrative that highlights the enduring human capacity to resist, to adapt, and to redefine oneself, even when the forces arrayed against that effort seem insurmountable, reminding us that the perceived boundaries of a people's potential are often the reflection of imposed, not inherent, limitations. From the moment Africans were first captured and transported across the Atlantic, their bodies became commodities, but their minds and spirits were the next target in a systematic campaign to justify their exploitation. As centuries passed, this physical domination was reinforced by an intellectual edifice built on distorted reasoning and pseudo-scientific claims that served the interests of those in power, weaving a narrative that portrayed Black people as inherently inferior and naturally suited for servitude. During the 16th through 19th centuries, Europe and the Americas witnessed a surge in theories and philosophies that cloaked prejudice in the guise of science, giving moral and intellectual legitimacy to the continuation of slavery and the social hierarchies that placed Africans at the bottom. Phrenology, which claimed to measure intelligence and moral capacity through the shape of the skull, provided a visual and ostensibly objective rationale for racial inequality, as practitioners argued that the cranial features of Black people indicated lesser intellect and moral development. It was a compelling and insidious tool, offering an empirical veneer to the deeply entrenched economic and social interests that depended on the subjugation of millions. This pseudo-scientific worldview did not exist in isolation. It intertwined with distorted interpretations of evolutionary theory, selective readings of history, and philosophical arguments that painted Africans as biologically and culturally destined for labor and obedience. Enlightenment thinkers, while championing liberty and reason for some, often excluded Black people from these universal claims, framing them as a species apart, inherently unfit for full human equality. Such interpretations created an intellectual scaffolding for slavery that reached beyond mere economics into the moral and spiritual spheres, suggesting that domination was not only necessary but natural, a reflection of divine or biological order rather than human imposition. In classrooms, pamphlets, and treatises, these ideas circulated widely, shaping not just the policies of colonial powers but also the subconscious beliefs of generations, embedding notions of inferiority in the social imagination in ways that would resonate long after the formal end of slavery. As these philosophies gained traction, their influence seeped into everyday life, informing legal codes, educational materials, and religious teachings. Laws that restricted property ownership, voting, and access to education for Black people were undergirded by an intellectual logic that suggested these measures were corrective rather than oppressive, designed to protect both the social order and the individuals themselves from the consequences of their supposed inadequacies. Textbooks taught children that Africans were naturally suited to servitude, Sermons preached that their subjugation was divinely sanctioned, and politicians invoked scientific reasoning to rationalize the continuation of racial hierarchies. The pervasiveness of these ideas meant that black communities were not only fighting the material conditions imposed upon them but also a deeply internalized narrative that questioned their worth, intelligence, and capacity to govern their own lives. Generations grew up navigating a world in which their very existence was framed as a cautionary tale. Their accomplishments and aspirations diminished in the shadow of so-called scientific and philosophical authority. Yet, history also shows that these narratives, powerful as they were, did not go untested within enslaved and free black communities. Oral traditions, cultural practices, and communal education became vital mechanisms for preserving dignity, knowledge, and a sense of self-worth that countered the poisonous messages of pseudoscience. Scholars, activists, and writers challenged these assumptions through rigorous evidence, compelling moral arguments, and lived example, demonstrating that intellect, creativity, and moral agency were not the exclusive province of one race but were universal human traits. The tension between imposed narratives of inferiority and the lived reality of black excellence created a dynamic landscape in which resistance was not only physical or political but also intellectual and cultural. A reclaiming of knowledge, identity, and humanity from the forces that sought to suppress it. The reach of these pseudosciences and philosophies also extended into the modern era, shaping enduring social attitudes and systemic inequalities long after the abolition of slavery. Educational gaps. Discriminatory policies and economic disparities cannot be fully understood without recognizing the historical scaffolding that positioned black people as less capable or deserving, a perception reinforced by centuries of supposed scientific validation. Recognizing this history allows a deeper comprehension of both the structural obstacles black communities face and the resilience they have displayed in confronting them. Every achievement, every intellectual contribution, every act of resistance becomes a testament to the falsity of those long-held beliefs and a reminder that these narratives were constructed, not inherent, imposed, not earned. Ultimately, the story of pseudosciences like phrenology and skewed philosophical interpretations of evolution is a cautionary tale of how knowledge, or the appearance of it, can be weaponized to justify cruelty, exploitation, and oppression. It underscores the importance of questioning received wisdom, of examining the motives behind purportedly objective claims, and of acknowledging the human cost when false narratives are allowed to dominate collective consciousness. The intellectual subjugation of black people was not a natural occurrence, but a deliberate, meticulously crafted system of thought designed to support economic, social, and political control. Understanding this history is essential not only to grasp the roots of racial inequality, but also to appreciate the ongoing struggle for recognition, equality, and the reclamation of humanity in the face of centuries of contrived inferiority. Even after the chains of slavery were officially broken, the promises of freedom were complicated by a legal and social framework that continued to enforce inequality and marginalize black communities. The formal abolition of slavery marked a historic victory, yet the underlying systems of power quickly adapted to preserve racial hierarchies, transforming bondage from a physical condition into a legal, political, and economic one. Court rulings like the infamous Dred Scott decision of 1857, which declared that African Americans could not be considered citizens under the Constitution, reinforced the notion that black lives were legally subordinate, depriving them of the protections and rights afforded to others. This decision was more than a legal technicality. It was a stark declaration that freedom and justice were conditional, contingent upon race, and determined by those in positions of authority. It laid the groundwork for centuries of judicial and legislative actions that would systematically limit the opportunities, agency, and rights of black people in ways that were less overtly violent but no less controlling than the slave markets had once been. Following the Civil War, the Reconstruction era offered a fleeting glimpse of possibility, with constitutional amendments granting citizenship and voting rights to formerly enslaved individuals. Yet, this progress was fragile and fiercely contested. Segregationist policies rapidly emerged, codified through Jim Crow laws across the southern United States, which mandated separate and unequal facilities for black and white citizens, including schools, public transportation, and even drinking fountains. These laws did more than enforce physical separation. They embedded a message of inferiority into daily life, reinforcing the social hierarchies that pseudo-scientific and philosophical doctrines had long justified. Black citizens were legally permitted to exist within society, but the law meticulously circumscribed the ways in which they could exercise influence, claim ownership, or pursue prosperity, perpetuating a cycle of marginalization and dependency that mirrored the psychological subjugation imposed during slavery. The barriers were not only structural but symbolic, a constant reminder that freedom, in practice, remained incomplete. Court rulings such as Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 further institutionalized these divisions under the guise of separate but equal, a doctrine that provided legal cover for widespread inequities. Public schools, hospitals, and transportation systems for black citizens were chronically underfunded and poorly maintained, ensuring that the opportunities available were far from equal in reality. Voting restrictions through literacy tests, poll taxes, and intimidation effectively silenced black political voices, depriving communities of the power to advocate for themselves or challenge oppressive systems. The economic implications were equally profound. Land ownership, access to capital, and employment opportunities were heavily constrained, making it difficult for black families to accumulate wealth or achieve upward mobility. These legal frameworks functioned as extensions of the same ideological structures that had justified slavery, translating centuries of racial bias into codified, enforceable policies that shaped every aspect of life, from education to employment, from housing to health care. Segregation did not merely enforce physical separation. It actively constructed and perpetuated narratives of cultural and intellectual inferiority. Black citizens were daily reminded of their marginalized status through public signage, school curricula, and community norms, reinforcing centuries of internalized messages that had been seeded by pseudoscience. Skewed philosophies and social prejudice. The psychological weight of these legal and societal structures was immense, creating a world in which aspirations were constantly constrained by invisible boundaries, and success often demanded extraordinary resilience, ingenuity, and courage. Resistance, both subtle and overt, became a necessary component of life, as black communities navigated systems designed to limit their potential while simultaneously striving to preserve dignity, culture, and agency. Despite these formidable barriers, black individuals and communities forged pathways of empowerment. Building institutions, cultivating education, and asserting political and social presence wherever possible. Churches, schools, and civic organizations became centers of learning, mutual aid, and political activism, nurturing a sense of identity and community cohesion that countered the oppressive messages embedded in law and custom. Figures such as Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, Webb, Du Bois, and countless others challenged the legal and social frameworks of their time, demonstrating that the limitations imposed by law were neither natural nor immutable. Their advocacy, scholarship, and courage illuminated the artificiality of these divisions and laid the groundwork for subsequent generations to demand justice, equity, and recognition. Understanding the impact of these laws and rulings also illuminates the enduring legacy of systemic inequality that persists today. Educational disparities, wealth gaps, voter suppression efforts, and segregated neighborhoods trace their roots to the careful codification of racial inferiority that began during slavery and continued through Reconstruction and Jim Crow. The legal mechanisms, while often disguised as neutral governance, operated to perpetuate control, marginalization, and social stratification, shaping the opportunities and life experiences of millions. Yet, this history also highlights resilience, the relentless pursuit of justice, and the capacity for communities to organize, resist, and reclaim rights even in the face of legal and structural oppression. The story of post-slavery legal oppression underscores a crucial lesson. Freedom on paper does not guarantee equality in practice, and the fight for civil and human rights demands vigilance, courage, and collective action. It illustrates how systems of power can adapt, finding new methods to maintain dominance, and how communities must remain equally adaptive, creative, and unwavering in pursuit of justice, through understanding the interwoven narratives of law, social policy, and lived experience. The enduring struggle for equity becomes not only a historical study but a blueprint for continued advocacy and transformation, reminding us that the legacy of inequality is both a challenge and a call to action for generations to come. Even long after the formal abolition of slavery and the dismantling of explicitly segregationist laws, the shadow of the lie of black inferiority continued to loom over communities, shaping identities, relationships, and social structures in ways that were often invisible yet deeply impactful. The psychological residue of centuries of oppression, enslavement, systemic discrimination, and pervasive pseudoscientific doctrines permeated everyday life, influencing how individuals perceived themselves, how families functioned, and how communities interacted with one another. This enduring myth of inherent inferiority was not merely an abstract concept. It became woven into the fabric of social expectation and self-perception, fostering an internalized sense of limitation and inadequacy that could echo across generations. Children grew up absorbing subtle messages from schools, media, and social institutions that their worth was conditional, that their potential was capped, and that the barriers they faced were natural rather than imposed, shaping the trajectory of their ambitions, choices, and sense of possibility. Family structures, which had already endured the violent ruptures of slavery, faced new forms of strain as economic instability, legal discrimination, and social marginalization compounded pressures within homes. The destabilization of familial authority and support systems was often invisible to outsiders, yet it profoundly affected the cohesion, resilience, and emotional well-being of entire generations. Single-parent households, economically constrained environments, and communities navigating the lingering effects of segregation often carried the weight of both historical trauma and contemporary marginalization. These conditions were not born of personal failure, but rather of structural forces designed over centuries to limit access to resources, education, and opportunity, reinforcing the insidious narrative that black communities were somehow inherently dysfunctional. Internalized stigma, amplified by external prejudice, created a subtle but persistent pressure to conform to diminished expectations, sometimes resulting in self-doubt, diminished self-worth, and a hesitancy to pursue opportunities that might otherwise be within reach. At the community level, these dynamics reinforce cycles of tension, mistrust, and social fragmentation, undermining collective empowerment. Local organizations, schools, and social networks often carried the dual responsibility of resisting external oppression, while also compensating for the psychological impact of centuries-long denigration. Leaders and mentors worked tirelessly to instill pride, resilience, and self-respect, yet the pervasive influence of long-standing stereotypes and systemic barriers meant that progress was uneven and often fragile. Even in moments of achievement or upward mobility, the internalized echoes of imposed inferiority could manifest as imposter syndrome, self-limitation, or skepticism of one's right to succeed, creating a quiet but enduring tension between aspiration and societal expectation. The media, cultural narratives, and social institutions played a critical role in perpetuating these beliefs, often presenting distorted portrayals of Black life that emphasized deficit, criminality, or dysfunction while neglecting stories of resilience, creativity, and achievement. These narratives, reinforced through textbooks, entertainment, and news, provided a constant, subtle reminder of societal bias, encouraging internalization of the very inferiority that the myth claimed to justify. Over time, the constant exposure to such portrayals could shape both individual identity and collective self-perception, creating psychological barriers that were as restrictive as any law or policy. This duality, external oppression and internalized self-doubt, created a feedback loop in which community cohesion, economic advancement, and familial stability were continually tested by forces both visible and unseen. Yet even within these challenges, the human spirit found ways to resist, adapt, and reclaim dignity. Across the United States and the African diaspora, communities developed strategies of resilience that drew upon cultural memory, spiritual practices, and intergenerational knowledge. Mentorship programs, educational initiatives, artistic expression, and civic engagement became vital tools for countering the insidious effects of internalized inferiority. These efforts not only nurtured individual growth but also reinforced collective identity, providing a foundation upon which families could rebuild trust, support one another, and cultivate a shared sense of possibility. Storytelling, historical preservation, and cultural celebration became acts of defiance, transforming inherited trauma into a source of strength, pride, and community solidarity. Education played a particularly transformative role, offering opportunities to challenge the narratives of inferiority and cultivate a renewed sense of self-worth. Black scholars, activists, and educators worked to dismantle myths, illuminate histories, and highlight the accomplishments and contributions of their communities. By creating spaces where children and adults could see themselves reflected in stories of achievement, leadership, and creativity, these efforts undermined centuries of imposed limitation and provided a counterweight to the psychological burdens of systemic discrimination. Schools, cultural centers, and local initiatives became arenas not only of knowledge transmission but of identity formation, fostering resilience and self-confidence that could ripple outward into families and neighborhoods. The enduring lie of Black inferiority thus reveals the profound interconnection between history, psychology, and community life, It shows how structural and ideological oppression can infiltrate not only laws and institutions, but also the very sense of self. Shaping decisions, relationships, and aspirations across generations. Yet, the response to this persistent myth through resilience. Cultural affirmation, education, and community building demonstrates the capacity for healing, empowerment, and transformation even in the face of enduring systemic barriers. By understanding these dynamics, we can appreciate both the depth of the challenges that have been imposed and the remarkable courage, creativity, and perseverance required to reclaim identity, dignity, and collective strength, highlighting the ongoing journey toward equity and self-determination. As we come to the close of this journey, it is essential to recognize that the story of Black communities is not merely a tale of oppression or inherited trauma, but also one of resilience, determination, and profound strength. The enduring myths and systemic barriers that sought to define Black people as inferior have, over centuries, left deep imprints on self-perception, family structures, and community cohesion. Yet, the very fact that these communities continue to thrive, create, and uplift one another is a testament to the unbreakable spirit that persists despite adversity. Reclaiming identity, nurturing self-love, and restoring family and community bonds are not abstract ideals. They are the foundational pillars through which freedom and societal restoration can truly flourish. Reclaiming identity begins with understanding the stories that were obscured or erased. For generations, African and African American heritage, achievements, and histories were deliberately marginalized or distorted, leaving many disconnected from their roots. By actively engaging with these histories, celebrating cultural achievements, and preserving ancestral knowledge, Black individuals and communities can reconstruct a sense of belonging and pride that challenges centuries of imposed inferiority. This process of reclamation is not only empowering on a personal level, but also strengthens community cohesion, creating networks of support and shared purpose. Schools, cultural institutions, mentorship programs, and storytelling initiatives serve as vital channels to transmit this knowledge, ensuring that each new generation grows up with a clear understanding of their heritage, potential, and value. Equally important is the cultivation of self-love and self-respect, which counters the internalized narratives of inadequacy imposed by centuries of oppression. Self-love is not simply an individual pursuit. It is a radical act of resistance against systemic forces that have sought to diminish worth and instill self-doubt. By nurturing self-esteem, fostering mental and emotional wellness, and embracing individual and collective strengths, Black people can disrupt cycles of internalized inferiority, empowering themselves to pursue education, careers, and creative endeavors with confidence and purpose. This journey often requires intentional reflection, engagement with supportive communities, and access to resources that affirm dignity and capability. Programs that focus on mental health, leadership development, and cultural affirmation become essential tools in this transformative process, creating the foundation for resilient and empowered individuals. Strong, nurturing Black families form the backbone of this transformation, serving as both sanctuaries and launching points for future generations. The family unit, historically disrupted by slavery, discriminatory policies, and economic marginalization, can be restored and strengthened through intentional cultivation of trust, communication, and shared values. Parents, elders, and mentors play critical roles in modeling resilience, instilling pride, and teaching the skills necessary for navigating a world that may still harbor systemic obstacles. Celebrating achievements, fostering mutual respect, and creating safe spaces for emotional expression within the family nurtures the next generation to grow into individuals who understand their worth. Capabilities and responsibilities. This familial foundation not only supports personal growth but also reinforces broader community stability, enabling families to collaborate, support each other, and collectively challenge social inequities. Communities, in turn, amplify the impact of empowered families and individuals by cultivating spaces of collaboration, cultural affirmation, and collective action. Communities become engines of resilience, social change, and restoration. Initiatives that promote education, entrepreneurship, civic engagement, and artistic expression empower members to contribute meaningfully to society while strengthening communal bonds. Celebrating success stories, mentoring youth, and preserving cultural heritage create an environment where self-worth is recognized, potential is nurtured, and collaboration is prioritized over competition or division. In this way, the restoration of Black families and communities represents not only personal triumphs, but also the reconstruction of societal structures that have long marginalized and diminished Black voices. Ultimately, the path toward freedom, resilience, and societal restoration is inseparable from the reclamation of identity, the nurturing of self-love, and the strengthening of family and community ties. These efforts confront and dismantle the enduring myths of inferiority while offering tangible tools for empowerment, achievement, and collective advancement. Every story told, every act of mentorship, every effort to preserve and celebrate heritage contributes to a broader narrative of hope, progress, and justice. By embracing these principles, Black communities can continue to write their own stories, define their own destinies, and shape societies that reflect equality, dignity, and mutual respect. Thank you for taking the time to engage with this important conversation. Your support makes a difference, and if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share the video so that more people can join in understanding, reflection, and empowerment. Together, we can honor history, recognize resilience, and inspire action toward a future where identity, self-worth, and family strength are celebrated as the true paths to freedom and societal restoration.